April 11th, 1945. 1:58 p.m. off Okinawa. Gray sea under a hard white sky. A destroyer is already moving before the lookouts finish shouting. Rudder over. Engines answering. The deck tilts just enough to make men widen their stance without thinking. Wind knifes across wet steel and carries the sour bite of cordite, salt, and hot paint. The ship's guns are barking at something small and fast in the glare, a single-engine shape skipping low through the haze like it has no fear left in it. The plane is coming anyway. It has that final war look. Hurried paint, a belly tank, a pilot who will not turn away. It grows from a speck to a tearing silhouette in seconds. The destroyer's 40 millimeters mounts track and fire, brass casings clattering across the deck, gunners leaning into recoil, faces clenched under steel helmets. A white wake cuts behind the ship as the helmsman tries to spoil the angle. Then the aircraft hits, not like a movie, like a car crash inside a boiler room. There's a flash that's too bright for black and white memory, a shock wave that slams men into bulkheads, and a noise that eats every other sound, metal folding, fuel detonating, steam lines screaming. The impact tears through a section of superstructure and opens the ship like a can. A moment later, the fire arrives, crawling and then leaping, feeding on aviation gasoline, paint, cordite, anything that will burn, making its own wind. Smoke pours down ladders and vents, thick and greasy, taking the air with it. Inside the ship, in the spaces below, the world becomes a corridor of darkness and heat. Lights die, intercoms crackle or go silent. Somewhere forward, a man is shouting for repair parties, but the words vanish into the roar. Men run on instinct along passageways that now feel narrower, ladders that are suddenly steep as cliffs, hands sliding along railings slick with condensation and sweat. This is the moment that decides whether a destroyer lives for the next hour or becomes a floating torch. A sailor in dungarees and a kapok jacket finds a fire main ruptured, water blasting the compartment like a broken hydrant. Another man, face smeared with soot, tries to spin a valve that won't move. Someone is coughing hard enough to fold in half. In the heat, paint bubbles on bulkheads. Steam condenses on cold steel and rains back down. The deck plates are warm under boots. There is a sharp, awful smell burning insulation, oil, and something else a man refuses to name. Over it all, there's a knowledge that fire is not the only killer now. Not on a destroyer. A destroyer is a long, narrow machine packed tight with fuel lines, electrical runs, magazines, torpedoes, depth charges, ready-use ammo lockers, everything that makes a ship fight, and everything that can turn a hit into a chain reaction. The Kamikaze doesn't need to sink the ship with one blow. It only needs to start the wrong thing burning in the wrong place. That is why the next orders are not heroic. They are procedural, brutal, nearly impossible. Flood this compartment. Isolate that run. Cut power. Shut ventilation. Boundary cool. Shore up the bulkhead. Jettison anything that can cook off. Keep the ship from killing itself. Somewhere below decks, a lieutenant junior grade is counting. Not aloud. Not for anyone's benefit, counting in the private way a man does when he knows what the clock means. He knows what happens when flame reaches ready ammunition. He knows what happens when heat creeps along a steel deck into the next base. He knows what happens when smoke finds a ventilation trunk and turns the entire ship into a chimney. Then the engineer arrives. He is not the kind of hero that gets a statue. He doesn't have a fighter swagger or a captain's bridge voice. He wears the same salt-stained uniform as the others, and he smells like machinery oil, sweat, boiler water, and metal. A Navy engineering officer, trained to think in systems. Pressure, flow, redundancy, isolation. A man who understands that a destroyer survives by staying organized while it's being torn apart. The engineer pushes into the damage control central station or a nearby control point, wherever there is still a board to read and men to direct. He takes one look at the reports, the dead circuits, the fractured main, the spreading fire zones, and he makes a decision that feels insane to anyone who thinks like a landsman. He orders the ship to take water on purpose, not a surrender, a technique, counterflooding to correct a list so the ship can keep fighting, and so hoses will reach where they're needed, control flooding to choke oxygen from a space that's becoming an oven, closing watertight boundaries, even when men are still inside adjacent compartments, because the alternative is losing the ship and everyone on it, shutting down ventilation, so smoke stops traveling knowing it will make the air worse for the men already in the dark. It is an impossible fix because it demands trust and training when every nerve is screaming to do the opposite. The repair lockers pre-assigned teams drilled into muscle memory move like a practice machine through chaos. No speeches. No debating. One team drags hoses that kick like live snakes as water pressure fluctuates. Another team hauls a portable electric pump, then swaps it for a gasoline-driven one when the power dies. Men hammer shoring timbers into place, wedging bulkheads, so they don't buckle as heat warps steel. A runner relays valve states by voice when phones fail. Someone chalk marks the boundary line where paint is too hot to touch. The engineer's voice is steady, clipped, and unromantic. He cares about minutes and valves and the fact that the fire main's pressure is dropping again. He orders a rig from a forward loop. He orders isolation of a fuel line that is feeding the blaze like a vein left open. He orders magazine sprinklers to stand by. He orders jettisoning of topside explosives if heat creeps closer. Above, the sea keeps slapping the hull. The ship keeps moving. The guns fall quiet for a moment, then resume, not because anyone believes it will stop what has already happened, but because the horizon is still full of threats. Below, a sailor crawls along a deck that feels soft with heat, guided by a rope line, breathing through a rubber mask that tastes like chemicals and fear. He can almost feel the ship's heart beating in the pipes around him. Steam, water, fuel every system either controlled or turning traitor. Somewhere close, flames make a sound like ripping cloth. A messenger reaches the engineer with a report. The fire has jumped into a new compartment. The boundary is failing. The water level is rising where it shouldn't. The list is increasing again. The engineer doesn't hesitate. He reaches for the one order that will save the ship or finish it. Flood deeper. Cut more away. The impossible fix is about to demand its price. The order goes out and the ship seems to protest. Valves turn. A steel wheel squeals as a sailor leans his whole weight into it. Water changes direction in the dark, filling spaces men were trained their whole lives to keep dry. It sluices across deck plates, cold and shockingly alive against the heat. It climbs, ankle deep, then higher. The sound is wrong, too much water inside a warship. Too quickly like hearing rain, inside your house. But the engineer is not thinking in feelings. He is thinking in compartments. He knows the destroyer is not one ship. It is 100 sealed boxes linked by hatches, trunks, pipes, and nerves. To save the whole, you sometimes sacrifice a box. You let it drown. You let the fire starve. You accept the weight, then you counter it somewhere else. That's the arithmetic that keeps steel afloat. Smoke has found the ventilation system. It pours through grates like a living thing, rolling low, thick as wool. Men drop to hands and knees without being told. Eyes sting, throat seize. The taste is electric burning insulation, paint, and oil caught in the back of the tongue. A chief petty officer slams a dogged hatch shut, spinning the handles fast, sealing a boundary. It feels like betrayal because someone had been working beyond that door minutes ago. The chief's jaw clenches, and he keeps turning until metal meets metal. The engineer watches, then nods once. No apology. No time. On deck, the sky is a washed-out sheet. The superstructure is torn and scorched, and the air is filled with drifting ash. A hose team braces against a rail, water arcing into a hole of smoke. The stream disappears as if swallowed. Steam blooms back at them, hot enough to scald. Their arms shake from recoil and fatigue. The nozzleman's gloves are slick. A second sailor grips his bell from behind, so he doesn't slide on the wet deck. Somewhere aft, a ready-use locker cooks. Ammunition pops, one round at a time. Sharp cracks like a string of firecrackers, deadly in the wrong direction. Men flinch and keep working anyway, because flinching doesn't stop a ship from dying. Below decks, the engineer listens to a cascade of reports, fragmented, breathless, carried by runners and shouted over the roar. Fire in the after crew's head, electrical short in the switchboard, flooding in a void space, loss of pressure on the starboard fire main, a man down in repair too, ventilation shut, smoke still moving. Each line is a fork in the road. Choose wrong and the ship becomes a memorial. The engineer points at the damaged control board, the crude map of steel compartments that now feels like a body on an operating table. He isn't alone. A small knot of men forms around him, a damaged control assistant, a bosun's mate, a machinist's mate who knows the plant like he knows his own hands. They speak in a language that sounds cold to outsiders. Isolate the riser. Rig the casualty power. Boundary cool bulkhead 2-91-0. Start the educator. Set zebra. This is not improvisation. This is doctrine. And doctrine is only useful if it has been beaten into muscle before Okinawa, before Leyte Gulf, before the Philippines became a gauntlet of suicide dives. The Navy learned the hard way that a modern ship could be killed by internal damage faster than by enemy gunnery. Fire spread like it had a plan. Smoke took men before flames did. Flooding, if unmanaged, stole stability in minutes. So they trained, not politely, not occasionally. They trained with a cruelty that felt absurd in calm seas. Men ran drills until their fingers could find valves in the dark. They practiced rigging hoses and foam lines until their shoulders burned. They learned how to shore a warped bulkhead, how to patch ruptured pipes, how to set boundaries so heat stopped traveling. They practiced casualty power, stringing thick cables through passageways to feed electricity to a vital circuit when the normal system died. They learned to fight fire while blinded by smoke and sweating through gas masks, because the first time you do it cannot be when the ship is already burning. Now the training shows up like a ghost that takes your hand. In a low compartment, a sailor's flashlight beam catches a sheen on the deck fuel, thin as a skin. He freezes, heart-punching. One spark and the compartment becomes a furnace. But he remembers. He signals. A second man drags absorbed material, smears it down, works fast, careful, almost gentle. Another sailor checks the overhead for a line that should be dry and finds it sweating. He traces it and finds a leak. He marks it and calls it in. A runner repeats the message up the ladder. The engineer hears it and orders isolation. A valve closes. The leak stops. One small disaster is removed from the chain. Up one level. A machinist's mate and a shipfitter work on a ruptured fire main. They can feel the heat through steel, but they also feel the ship's survival narrowing to this one pipe. They slam a clamp around the break, bolt it down, pack it with gasket material, tighten until knuckles split and forearms tremble. Water pressure surges back. Hoses above strengthen. Streams hitting flame with more authority. A cheer almost rises and dies in their throats. There is still too much to do. The engineer makes his impossible fix more impossible. He orders counterflooding to correct the list. The ship has taken uneven damage. A void space is flooded on one side, and topside water from firefighting pools and pockets. The destroyer begins to lean a subtle angle that grows. If it leans far enough, the deck becomes a slide. Hoses pull men off their feet. Pumps lose suction. A ship that lifts too hard can't fight, can't maneuver, can't even keep its own guns trained. So the engineer tells them to flood another space on purpose on the opposite side. Controlled flooding. Measured. The word sounds calm, but the act is terrifying. Water enters a compartment that was, minutes ago, a place men slept or stored gear. It fills with determined, indifferent force. Someone reads a sounding tube, calls out feet and inches. Another man watches the inclinometer. The engineer listens and adjusts like a man balancing a loaded rifle on his finger. The ship rights itself to a degree. Then another. Outside, the sea doesn't care. Inside, that 1 degree feels like the difference between life and a slow roll to death. Then comes a moment every engineer dreads. The plant is threatened. If the fire reaches engineering spaces, if it gets into boiler room, if it forces a shutdown, then the destroyer becomes a drifting target with its wounds exposed. Power is everything. To pump, to steer, to fight. A runner appears, face streaked with sweat and soot, and shouts that heat is pushing toward an access trunk near the forward fire room. Smoke is heavier there. Men can't stay long. The engineer's eyes harden. He knows what must happen next, and it's not noble. It's a necessity. He orders the ventilation cut even further. He orders boundaries sealed. He orders men into the trunk anyway, because if the ship loses steam, it loses the war inside its own hull. They go, one after another, hunched under the weight of gear, breathing through masks, hands on rope lines, disappearing into a space that feels like the throat of a furnace. And then in the darkness, a second problem reveals itself, quiet at first, then unmistakable. The ship is flooding somewhere they didn't plan to flood. Water is rising below, and it's not coming from a control valve. It's coming from the sea. The Kamikaze didn't just bring fire. It opened the destroyer's skin. The engineer turns back to the board, and for the first time since the hit, his voice tightens. Find it. Patch it. Now. Because if the sea is getting below the waterline, all the fire doctrine in the world won't matter. The search for the leak is a hunt through heat, noise, and bad air. A destroyer is narrow, packed, lay like a machine folded into itself. When a hole opens below the waterline, the ocean doesn't rush in like a wave in a doorway. It comes in with purpose through seams, rivets, cracked plating jetting, hissing, filling bilges and voids until stability starts to disappear. You don't always see it first. You feel it in the ship's posture. You hear it in the pumps laboring harder. You taste it in the air turning wetter. A damage control party drops into a lower space with flashlights and a sound-powered phone. Their boots hit a deck plate that should be dry and splash. The water is cold and already calf-deep in the lowest spots. It sloshes with the ship's movement, each roll sending it left, then right, like the sea is learning the interior layout. One sailor kneels and runs his hand along the bulkhead seam, hunting for the telltale vibration of stream under pressure. Another sweeps a flashlight beam along the deck edge, looking for the sparkle of incoming water. The space is loud pumps, distant fire, steel groaning, but there's a thinner sound underneath, like air being torn. They find it, a narrow jet, almost needle-fine, shooting through a split seam. It looks small. That's the trap. Small leaks become big floods because they never stop. The men move in with a discipline that feels unreal under the circumstances. A plug kit comes out, softwood wedges, canvas, rubber, a hammer. Someone shouts measurements. Another relays to damage control central. The engineer hears and answers in short bursts, feeding orders back down the line. Patch it short, keep the pump suction clear, report rate of rise. A wedge goes in. It resists, then bites. The jet turns into a spray, then a hard seep. A sailor presses canvas against it, palms burning from friction and cold. Another man wraps the patch with line, cinching it like a tourniquet. Water still comes in. The seam is too long. The plating is warped. Impact shock has twisted the ship's skeleton. The shipfitter, hands thick, face unreadable, pulls out a shoring timber and sets it across the bulkhead, bracing the patch with a makeshift brace, then drives it tight with maul until it sings. The leak slows again. A pump clears from the water. The men watch the level like gamblers staring at a spinning wheel. It holds, for now, but the leak isn't the only enemy below. Salt water is crawling into electrical spaces, and electricity doesn't forgive. One wrong contact, one flooded junction box, and you get arcing white-hot violent, like lightning trapped in a room. It starts fires. It kills men. It knocks systems offline in the exact moment you need them. The engineer orders casualty power rigged to critical circuits. Casualty power is the Navy's answer to chaos, a way to bypass shattered wiring and feed electricity to what must live pumps, lighting in key spaces, communications, steering control. Men uncoil heavy cables and drag them through passageways, over combings, around corners slick with water and foam. The cable is thick as a wrist and stubborn. It catches on hatch slips, scrapes paint, leaves black streaks along bulkheads. Sailors grunt, muscles shaking, hauling it into place while smoke presses down from above like a ceiling. A young electrician's mate kneels in the glow of a handheld lamp, hands steady over exposed terminals. He smells ozone. He can hear the faint, dangerous hum of current seeking a path. He connects one end, then the other, fingers careful, jaw clenched. Someone calls out, "Stand by," and the engineer's voice answers through the sound-powered phone, "Energize." Lights flicker in a compartment that has been black since the hit. Dim, unstable, but present. A pump kicks, coughs, and begins to pull water again. A man laughs once a sharp, surprised bark, then stops, embarrassed, as if laughter might tempt fate. Above, the fire is still not beaten. The boundary teams are fighting a war measured in inches. They lay hands on bulkheads to feel heat. They watch paint blisters. They spray water to keep steel from transmitting flame into the next space. Boundary cooling is unglamorous, repetitive, and absolutely decisive. If the boundary holds, the ship lives. If it fails, the ship becomes a chain reaction. The engineer moves between reports like a man reading a battlefield map. Fire boundaries, flooding boundaries, electrical boundaries, all of it shifting. He knows the destroyer's design, the redundancy in fire mains, the locations of educators, the weak points where a blaze can leap across a passageway and find fuel or ammo. He knows where the magazines sit like sleeping giants. Then comes a message that makes men swallow hard. Heat near a magazine boundary. A destroyer carries depth charges and ammunition for everything from 5-inch guns to 20mm mounts. The magazines are armored spaces meant to protect that ammunition from enemy fire. But they are not meant to be cooked from the inside by a kamikaze fuel blaze. When ammunition cooks off, it doesn't always explode all at once. It can detonate in violent pulses, ripping steel, tearing the ship's belly open. The engineer orders magazine sprinklers. The word sprinkler sounds harmless. In reality, it is an emergency flood system for ammunition spaces, salt water flooding the magazine to keep rounds from detonating. It can ruin ammunition. It can damage the ship. It can add weight in the worst places. It is, in effect, a command decision to trade fighting power for survival. The valve is opened. Somewhere deep inside the ship, seawater pours into a magazine space, soaking stacked shells and powder cases. Men can almost imagine the water running over the metal, a cold hand slapped onto a hot wound. The immediate threat eases. Another step away from catastrophe. But every step has a cost. The ship is heavier now, lower in the water. Pumps are running constantly. Men are exhausting themselves in masks and wet clothes, hands cramping around nozzles and tools. The air feels used up. The engineer looks at the inclinometer again. Lifts under control, but the margin is thin. He listens to the plant report. Boilers still lit, steam pressure holding, but the forward spaces are hot and smoke-choked. He hears that a repair party is trapped by smoke behind a dogged hatch. Trapped. The engineer closes his eyes for a fraction of a second, not as a prayer, but as a calculation. There is a boundary that must stay shut to keep the fire from traveling. Opening it risks feeding oxygen to flame, spreading smoke, destroying everything the last hour has gained. But leaving men sealed in is its own kind of sentence. He orders a rescue attempt through an alternate route through a scuttle, through a trunk, through whatever path the ship still offers. Men move again, crawling through spaces that are too tight, too hot, too full of smoke. You can almost feel the claustrophobia tightening around their ribs. And then, through the phone, another report arrives, one the engineer has been dreading since the moment of impact. The steering gear is acting up. Not dead. Not yet. But sluggish. Unreliable. A destroyer without reliable steering near Okinawa is not just wounded, it is a target that can't dodge the next strike. The engineer's impossible fix has kept the ship afloat and the fire contained. Now it has to do something else. It has to keep the destroyer maneuvering while half his body is on fire and the other half is filled with seawater. Because out on the horizon, the air raid is not over. The steering casualty starts as a feeling more than a fact. On the bridge, the destroyer answers the rudder with a delay that makes experienced hands glance at each other. The ship's motion is slightly wrong, like a horse that flinches before obeying the reins. The helmsman overcorrects, then corrects again, and the wake behind the stern scribbles uncertainty into the sea. Down below, in the steering gear room, the air is damp and hot. The compartment smells of hydraulic oil, metal, and sweat. The lighting is weak and makes everything look older than it is. A machinist's mate crouches beside a ram, listening for a stutter in the system, watching pressure twitch on a gauge that should be steady. Another man wipes grime from his hands and reaches into a toolbox with fingers that shake from exhaustion. The engineer arrives, pushed forward by urgency and pulled by dread. If the steering gear fails completely, the destroyer becomes a drifting, burning silhouette off Okinawa. Every pilot searching for a target can spot that. Every submarine commander can calculate that. Every incoming wave can exploit that. A destroyer survives air attacks by moving, turning, spoiling angles, staying unpredictable. A wounded ship that cannot maneuver is a ship the enemy can finish at leisure. The engineer doesn't speak in speeches. He points. He assigns. He anchors the chaos to a plan. He orders the system isolated and tested in pieces. He has men check the hydraulic lines for damage from shock. He has them check for contamination in the fluid, water, or debris that can make valves stick. He orders a bypass rig. He orders a hand pump stage as a last resort. He orders casualty power routes verified again, because steering control needs electricity as much as it needs hydraulics. Men move like they are underwater, heavy-limbed, but still precise. One sailor runs a hand along a line and finds it. A small weep, a slick sheen, a fitting that is worked loose under impact. It looks like nothing. But nothing is what kills you on a ship. They tighten it. They bleed the line. They top off the reservoir with fluid that smells sharp and chemical. The engineer watches the gauge climb back toward where it belongs. He nods once and turns away before anyone can mistake relief for safety. Because above, the air raid siren starts again. Not a single clear wail, but the brassy, urgent tone that turns men into practice motions. The ship's guns come alive in a staggered rhythm. The destroyer is still fighting, still moving, still trying to look dangerous enough that another pilot chooses a different target. The engineer climbs back toward Damage Control Central, where the ship's survival is being managed like a surgical operation under artillery fire. The board is marked in chalk and grease pencil, compartments shaded, notes scribbled fast. Flooding is controlled here, fire contained there, power restored to a vital circuit, a boundary holding by minutes. A runner meets him with a report, voice hoarse through smoke. The main fire is diminishing. Foam has taken hold in one space. Boundary cooling is working. The magazine boundary temperature is falling. The words should feel like victory. They do not. The ship is still bleeding. Pumps are running constantly. Men are collapsing from heat and smoke, dragged into cleaner air and slapped awake because there are not enough hands to spare. Hoses continue to pound the deck with water that now has nowhere to go, pooling in corners, draining into scuppers, shifting with every roll. Salt water has infiltrated spaces it never belonged in, and every wet cable run is now a future failure waiting to happen. The engineer looks at the inclinometer again. The ship is steadier. The list is corrected, not because the damage is gone, but because the balance is being managed like a living thing. Counterflooding has made the destroyer heavier and lower, but stable enough to keep fighting. Then comes the quietest, most dangerous moment of the entire ordeal. The lull. When flames recede, men start to believe the story is ending. That belief is how ships die after surviving the hit. Secondary fires ignite behind bulkheads where heat lingers. A hidden leak restarts, water rising unnoticed until it reaches an electrical panel. A smoldering cable run blossoms into smoke in the wrong trunk. A damaged valve fails under pressure and turns a controlled system into a fresh casualty. The engineer refuses a lull. He orders rechecks. He orders rounds through compartments that nobody wants to enter again. He orders boundaries retaken by hand, palms pressed to steel to feel heat. He orders ventilation restored in measured stages, dampers cracked open and monitored, so fresh air does not feed a fire that is only pretending to be dead. He orders ammunition inspected, topside lockers cleared of anything that can cook off later, hours compressed into a tunnel of labor. At some point, the smoke begins to thin. It loses its oily thickness and becomes a gray veil. The deck stops being a skating rink of foam and water and becomes merely wet steel. Men's faces become visible again, streaked with soot, eyes bloodshot, expressions hollowed out by strain. A sailor leans against a bulkhead and slides down to sit, head tilted back, mouth open, chest rising hard. Another man steps over him without cruelty, only necessity. The engineer stands near the board, listening to the ship's heartbeat return. Steam pressure is stable. Electrical loads are manageable. Flooding contained and being pumped down. Steering responding. Fire boundaries are cold. Magazine safe. The ship is not whole. It is alive. The captain's voice comes through, low and firm. The sound of a man who understands what he almost lost. The destroyer is to remain on station until relieved, then withdraw for repairs. The sea around Okinawa is still full of threats, and the damaged ship will not get special mercy. On deck, the afternoon light slants through smoke and makes everything look like a photograph that will later be studied and mislabeled. Men coil hoses with hands that do not want clothes anymore. A gun crew wipes sweat and soot from a sight. Someone picks up a spent casing and tosses it into a pile with a clink that sounds too small for what it represents. The engineer walks the ship. He pauses at the torn steel where the aircraft struck. He sees the twisted metal, the scorched paint, the jagged hole patched with hurried work. He sees the blackened ladders where men climbed into smoke. He sees the places where water lines were clamped, cables rerouted, boundaries held by sweat and training. He sees the cost in a way no after-action report ever captures. This is the real weapon that made destroyers survive. Not armor, not a miracle gun, not a single brilliant invention. A system built from doctrine, gear, and relentless rehearsal. A machine designed with redundancy. A culture that drilled men to think in compartments and casualties instead of panic. An engineer who understood that the ship was a living network of flows and boundaries, and that survival was something you engineer minute by minute while the world burned. Later, newspapers and official citations will find a few names and pin them to a few moments. The truth is broader and harsher. Hundreds of hands, moving by instinct born from training, making choices that felt wrong but were right, turning the ocean itself into a tool, using water to fight fire, using flooding to restore balance, using discipline to keep fear from becoming the final casualty. The destroyer steams away at dusk, scarred and trailing a faint haze, still moving under its own power. Out beyond the horizon, the next wave of aircraft is already forming somewhere in the thinning light, and the men who survive today know what tomorrow will demand.